The cold bit into Rose Harper's skin like 1,000 needles as she stumbled through the snow. Her wedding dress torn and muddy beneath her wool coat, and all she could think was that Thomas had looked her straight in the eye 2 hours before their ceremony, and said he couldn't marry a woman whose father lost everything to drink and debt. The blizzard had come down from the mountains without warning that February afternoon in 1884, turning golden Colorado into a white nightmare, but Rose didn't care if she froze to death in the streets, because the pain in her chest hurt worse than any winter storm could manage. She had stood there in the church vestibule in her borrowed white dress, holding wilted wildflowers, while Thomas Fletcher explained that his business partners advised against the union, that marrying into a disgraced family would ruin his reputation as a banker, that he hoped she understood it wasn't personal. The guests were already seated. The minister was waiting, and Thomas had simply walked away, leaving her there with his mother's pitying eyes and the whispers that followed like ghosts. Rose didn't remember leaving the church or walking past the mercantile and the saloon. She only knew that the wind was screaming and her feet were numb, and somewhere behind her, someone was calling her name, but she couldn't stop moving because if she stopped, she would have to feel everything, and she wasn't ready for that. The main street gave way to open prairie, and the town lights faded behind her until there was nothing but white emptiness and the howling storm. She didn't know how long she walked. Time became meaningless in the blizzard. Her fingers stopped working and her legs felt like iron weights, and eventually she couldn't remember why she was walking or where she'd been going. The cold stopped hurting, which seemed wrong somehow, but she couldn't quite figure out why. Her knees buckled and she fell into a snowdrift, and the sky above was gray and endless and almost peaceful. Then there were hands lifting her, strong and sure, and a voice cutting through the wind. "I've got you. Stay with me now." Rose tried to open her eyes, but her lashes were frozen together. She felt herself being lifted onto a horse, felt a solid chest against her back and arms wrapped around her waist, holding her steady in the saddle. The horse moved beneath them, and the man behind her kept talking, his voice low and steady. "Not much further. Ranch is just over the ridge. You're going to be fine. Just hold on." She wanted to tell him that fine was relative, that her heart was already broken, so what did it matter if her body gave out too? But her tongue wouldn't work and the darkness was pulling at her, warm and inviting despite the cold. The next thing Rose knew, she was lying on a couch near a roaring fire, and someone was rubbing her hands and feet with rough cloth, pain shooting through her extremities as feeling returned. She gasped and tried to pull away, but firm hands held her still. "I know it hurts," that same steady voice said, "but we need to get the blood flowing again. You've got frostbite, but it's not too bad if we warm you up slow." Rose forced her eyes open and found herself staring at a man who looked to be in his late 20s, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of honey in sunlight. He was kneeling beside the couch, his sleeves rolled up, his face lined with concentration as he worked. The room around them was simple but well kept, a ranch house with wooden walls and thick rugs on the floor and the sweet smell of wood smoke and coffee. "Who are you?" Rose managed, her voice cracking. "Asher Norton," he said, not looking up from his work on her feet. "This is my ranch, about 3 miles west of Golden. Found you collapsed in the snow about 50 yards from my barn. You're lucky I was riding back from checking the herd." "I wasn't trying to be lucky." His hand stilled for a moment, and his eyes flicked up to meet hers. There was something knowing in his gaze, something that saw more than she wanted to show. "I gathered that," he said quietly, "but you're alive anyway, so we'll work with what we've got." Rose looked away, tears burning her eyes. She was still wearing the ruined wedding dress beneath the blankets someone had piled on top of her. The lace was torn and stained, the hem black with mud and snow. It seemed like the perfect metaphor for the day. "I need to get back to town," she said. "Not in this storm. It's full dark now and the blizzard's worse than before. You'll stay here tonight and we'll see about getting you home in the morning. I can't impose. You can and you will." Asher stood and walked to the stove, pouring something from a pot into a tin cup. He brought it back and pressed it into her hands. "Drink this. It's soup. You need to warm up from the inside, too." Rose's hands shook as she lifted the cup to her lips. The soup was simple, just broth and vegetables, but it tasted like the best thing she'd ever eaten. She drank it slowly, feeling warmth spread through her chest, though it did nothing for the hollow ache beneath her ribs. Asher settled into a chair across from her, watching her with those careful eyes. He didn't ask questions, didn't push, just sat there like he had all the time in the world. Outside, the wind rattled the windows and the snow piled higher, but inside, the fire crackled and the silence was almost comfortable. Finally, Rose said, "I was supposed to get married today." Supposed to. He changed his mind. 2 hours before the ceremony. She laughed, but it came out broken. "Said marrying me would be bad for his business. My father drank himself into debt, you see, and then drank himself into an early grave 6 months ago. I thought Thomas didn't care about that. I thought he loved me. I was wrong." Asher's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed gentle. "Then he's a fool. He's practical. There's a difference." "No," Asher said. "There's not. A man who would leave a woman at the altar because of money or reputation isn't practical. He's a coward, and you're better off without him." Rose wanted to argue, but she was too tired and too cold and too heartbroken. She finished the soup and set the cup aside, pulling the blankets tighter around her shoulders. "I don't feel better off. I feel humiliated. That's his doing, not yours. You showed up. You were ready to make promises and keep them. He's the one who broke faith." The simple kindness in his words cracked something open inside her, and suddenly she was crying, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. She covered her face with her hands, ashamed and unable to stop, and then Asher was there beside her on the couch, not touching her but close enough that she could feel his presence, solid and steady. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "Let it out. Nobody here but me, and I don't judge tears." So Rose cried until she had nothing left, until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, and the tears finally slowed to a trickle. Asher handed her a handkerchief, and she wiped her face, feeling emptied out but somehow lighter. "Thank you," she whispered. "Nothing to thank me for. You saved my life. Maybe, or maybe you just needed a warm place to figure things out." He stood and walked to a door on the far side of the room. "You'll sleep in here tonight. It's my room, but I'll take the couch. There's clean clothes in the dresser if you want to get out of that dress. I know they'll be too big, but they're warm and dry." Rose started to protest, but he was already pulling extra blankets from a chest and making up the couch for himself. She realized with a start that he was giving her his bed, giving her privacy, asking nothing in return. It was so different from Thomas's calculating affection, from the way her former fiancé had always tallied what he gave against what he got, that she felt tears threaten again. She stood carefully, testing her feet. They hurt, but they held her weight. She walked to the bedroom door and paused, looking back at Asher. "Why are you being so kind to me?" He met her eyes, and there was something fierce in his expression. "Because you deserve kindness, and because I know what it's like to be left out in the cold." Rose wanted to ask what he meant, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a heavy tide. She nodded and slipped into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. The room was simple and masculine, with a large bed covered in a worn quilt and a dresser that had seen better days. She found a flannel shirt and thick wool pants in one of the drawers and changed out of the ruined wedding dress, hanging it over the back of a chair where it dripped onto the floor. She climbed into the bed and pulled the quilt up to her chin. The sheets smelled like soap and leather, and something earthy she couldn't quite name. Through the door, she could hear Asher moving around, banking the fire and settling in for the night. She closed her eyes and expected to lie awake for hours, replaying every moment of the day, but instead she fell asleep almost immediately, her body too exhausted to let her mind torture her anymore. When Rose woke, pale winter sunlight was streaming through the window, and the smell of frying bacon filled the air. She sat up slowly, her body aching in a dozen places, and realized the storm had passed. Outside the window, the world was white and clean and blindingly bright. She got dressed in Asher's borrowed clothes, rolling up the sleeves and the pant legs so she wouldn't trip, and emerged from the bedroom to find him standing at the stove, turning bacon in a cast iron skillet. He glanced over his shoulder and gave her a slight smile. "Morning. How do you feel?" "Like I walked through a blizzard," Rose said, attempting humor. "But alive, thank you for the bed. Couch was fine. I've slept in worse places." He gestured to the table. "Sit down. Breakfast is almost ready." Rose settled into one of the wooden chairs and watched him work. He moved with easy confidence, flipping eggs and pouring coffee, and she found herself studying him in the morning light. He was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and calloused hands and a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. He wasn't polished like Thomas, didn't wear fancy suits or spend time slicking his hair into place, but there was something solid about him, something real. He set a plate in front of her, piled high with bacon, eggs, and thick slices of toast, and Rose realized she was starving. They ate in companionable silence for a while, and then Asher said, "I can take you back to Golden this morning if you want. Roads should be clear enough for the wagon." Rose's stomach clenched at the thought of going back, of facing the whispers and the pitying looks and her mother's disappointment. "I suppose I have to face it eventually." "You don't have to do anything," Asher said, "but running forever gets tiring, speaking from experience." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "I came out here 5 years ago from Kansas. I was engaged to a woman back there, planning to take over my father's farm. Then my brother got drunk one night and told me the truth he'd been sitting on for months. My fiancé had been seeing him behind my back. They'd been together for almost a year, laughing at me the whole time. So I broke the engagement, sold my share of the farm to my father and came west, built this ranch from nothing." Rose felt her heart contract with sympathy. "I'm sorry." "That's horrible," it was. "For a long time. But out here I found something I didn't have back in Kansas, space to breathe, room to be myself without everyone watching and judging. The ranch is small, but it's mine, and I built it with my own hands. That matters. Do you ever regret leaving?" "Not once." He looked at her, and his eyes were warm. "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us push us toward the places we're meant to be. Maybe this is your push." Rose wanted to believe him, but the pain was still too fresh. She finished her breakfast and helped Asher clean up, then stood at the window while he went out to hitch the wagon. The ranch spread out before her, simple but beautiful, with the barn and a few outbuildings, and beyond them, rolling white hills that stretched to the mountains. It looked peaceful, like a place where a person could heal. Asher brought the wagon around and Rose climbed up beside him, wrapped in a thick coat he'd lent her. They drove in silence for most of the trip, the horses plodding through the snow, and Rose tried to prepare herself for what was coming. The gossip, the shame, her mother's tears and her sister's anger and Thomas's cold indifference if she saw him on the street. As they neared the edge of town, Asher said, "If you need anything, you know where to find me. I mean that. Anything at all. You've already done so much." "Maybe I'm selfish," he said. a hint of a smile on his lips. "Maybe I'm hoping you'll come back." Rose's heart skipped, and she looked at him sharply, but his eyes were on the road. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, just held onto his words like a lifeline as they rolled into golden. He drove her to her mother's house on the south side of town, a small cottage that had seen better days. Rose's mother, Eleanor, came rushing out when she saw the wagon, her face pale with worry. "Rose. Oh my God, Rose, we've been looking everywhere. When you didn't come home last night, I thought you'd frozen to death in the storm." She pulled Rose into a crushing embrace, then stepped back and looked her up and down. "Where were you? Whose clothes are these?" "This is Asher Norton," Rose said, gesturing to him. "He found me in the blizzard and gave me shelter at his ranch." Eleanor's eyes went wide, then narrowed with suspicion. "You spent the night at a stranger's ranch. Rose, what were you thinking? People will talk." "People are already talking," Rose said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Let them talk about this too. Mr. Norton saved my life. I'm grateful to him." Asher tipped his hat to Eleanor. "Your daughter was in danger, madam. I wasn't going to leave her to die in the snow. I promise you I was a perfect gentleman." Eleanor softened slightly, but she still looked worried. "I appreciate what you did, Mr. Norton, truly. But Rose, you need to think about your reputation. After what happened yesterday, you can't afford any more scandal." Rose felt anger flare in her chest. "My reputation? What about Thomas's reputation? He's the one who left me at the altar, but I'm the one who has to worry about scandal." "That's not fair, but it's the way the world works," Eleanor said tiredly. "You know that." Asher cleared his throat. "I'll be going. Rose, you know where to find me if you need anything." Rose nodded, feeling suddenly bereft as he drove away. She watched the wagon disappear down the street, then followed her mother inside, bracing herself for the difficult days ahead. The next 2 weeks were exactly as bad as Rose had feared. Everywhere she went, people whispered and stared. Some were sympathetic, but others seemed to delight in her humiliation. Thomas avoided her completely, and his friends spread rumors that Rose had been too demanding, too particular, that she'd driven him away with her expectations. It was all lies, but the lies spread faster than the truth ever could. Rose's younger sister, Anna, tried to be supportive, but she was only 17 and didn't understand the depth of Rose's pain. Her mother alternated between coddling her and lecturing her about finding another husband before she got too old. At 22, Rose was already considered close to being a spinster, and the failed engagement hadn't helped her prospects. Rose felt suffocated by the town, by the constant scrutiny and judgment. She took long walks to escape her mother's house, and more than once, she found herself heading west, toward the edge of town where the prairie began and Asher's ranch lay just beyond the horizon. On a bright morning in early March, she finally gave in to the pull. She borrowed her mother's horse and rode out to the ranch, telling herself she was just going to return Asher's clothes and thank him properly. But as the ranch came into view, she realized she'd been lying to herself. She wanted to see him again. She wanted to feel the peace she'd felt in his home, the sense that the world was bigger than Golden and its gossip. Asher was working in the corral when she arrived, training a young horse on a long lead. He looked up when he heard hoofbeats, and his face broke into a genuine smile that made Rose's stomach flip. "Rose, this is a surprise." She dismounted and walked to the fence, holding out a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "I brought your clothes back, washed and mended." The shirt had a tear in the shoulder. "You didn't have to do that." He tied off the horse and came over, taking the bundle. "But I appreciate it. How have you been?" "Honestly, terrible. The whole town is talking about me. Half of them think I did something to drive Thomas away, and the other half pity me like I'm a lost cause." Asher's expression darkened. That's not right. You deserve better than their judgment, maybe, but I can't change how people think. Rose looked out at the snowy hills, at the wide open space that seemed to promise freedom. I needed to get away for a while. I hope you don't mind me coming here. Mind, I've been hoping you would. He leaned against the fence, his eyes warm. You're welcome here anytime, Rose. I mean that. They talked for a while, standing by the corral in the cold sunshine, and Rose felt something in her chest loosen. Asher didn't treat her like she was broken or pitiful. He talked to her like she was strong, like she was capable, like she was more than just a woman who'd been left at the altar. He told her about the ranch, about his plans to expand the herd in the spring, about the wild horse he was trying to tame and the calf that had been born during the blizzard and survived against all odds. When Rose finally mounted her horse to leave, Asher said, "Come back whenever you want. Even if it's just to sit by the fire and not talk. You don't have to have a reason." Rose nodded, feeling warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. "Thank you, Asher." She rode back to town feeling lighter than she had in weeks. And the next week, when the walls of her mother's house started closing in again, she rode back to the ranch. And the week after that. And the week after that. Each visit, she and Asher grew more comfortable with each other. He taught her how to work with the horses, how to read their body language and earn their trust. She helped him with chores around the ranch, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs and mending tack in the barn while he worked. They talked about everything and nothing, swapping stories about their childhoods and their dreams and their disappointments. Rose found herself looking forward to the visits more than she wanted to admit. When she was with Asher, she didn't feel like the jilted almost bride. She felt like herself, like the person she'd been before Thomas and his calculated affection had made her doubt her worth. By the middle of April, the snow had melted and the prairie was turning green, and Rose was riding out to the ranch 3 times a week. Her mother disapproved, warning her about impropriety and reputation, but Rose was tired of living her life by other people's rules. She was careful to leave before dark, to maintain a proper distance, but she couldn't bring herself to stay away. One warm afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink toward the mountains, Asher said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you walk into the blizzard that day? You're not the type to give up easily. What made you do it?" Rose was quiet for a long time, searching for the right words. "I felt so stupid. I'd been so sure that Thomas loved me, that we were building a life together. And then in one moment, I found out it was all a lie. He didn't love me. He loved the idea of me, or at least the idea he'd had before my father died and the money disappeared. I felt like I'd been sleepwalking through my own life, and suddenly I was wide awake and everything was ugly and cold. I couldn't stand it. I just wanted to escape. And now I'm grateful I didn't die in that snow, because if I had, I never would have found this." She gestured at the ranch, at the wide sky and the peaceful land. "I never would have found you." Asher reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and rough and steady. "I'm grateful, too. That I found you, that you kept coming back." Rose's heart was pounding. "Asher, I need to tell you something. These visits, spending time with you, it's been the best part of my days. You make me feel like myself again, like I'm worth something." "You are worth something," he said fiercely. "You're worth everything." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, but Rose didn't want to pull away. She wanted him, with a clarity that took her breath away. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet and nothing like the kisses she'd shared with Thomas. Those had been perfunctory, dutiful. This felt like coming home. When they pulled apart, Asher rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks." "Why didn't you?" "Because you needed time to heal. I didn't want to rush you or make you feel like I was taking advantage." Rose smiled, feeling tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears this time. "You're a good man, Asher Norton." "I'm a man who's falling in love with you," he said simply. "If that's too much too soon, tell me and I'll slow down, but I won't lie about how I feel." Rose's breath caught. It was too soon by all reasonable measures. She'd only known him for 2 months, but the heart didn't work on reasonable timelines, and hers was telling her something she couldn't ignore. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." "Why?" "Because what if I'm wrong again? What if I'm just looking for someone to fix what Thomas broke?" Asher cupped her face in his hands, his eyes serious. "You're not wrong, and you don't need fixing. You were never broken, Rose. You just needed someone who could see your worth. I see it. Every single day." Rose kissed him again, putting all her fear and hope and growing love into it. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Rose knew she needed to get back to town before full dark. But she didn't want to leave. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "I know. But come back tomorrow." "I will." Rose rode back to Golden with her heart singing, and for the first time since the failed wedding, she felt like the future might hold something good. Over the next few months, Rose and Asher's relationship deepened. He courted her properly, riding into town to take her on walks and bringing her wildflowers and sitting with her on her mother's porch, while Alina watched them like a hawk. The town gossip shifted from Rose's humiliation to speculation about the cowboy who'd won her heart, and some people seemed genuinely happy for her, while others whispered that she was moving too fast, that she'd regret it. Rose didn't care what they thought anymore. She knew what she felt, and she knew Asher was nothing like Thomas. He didn't calculate or keep score. He loved her freely, openly, without reservation. He talked about a future together without hedging or making excuses. He introduced her to his neighbors and his friends and spoke of her with pride, not shame. By June, Asher asked her to marry him. They were sitting by the creek that ran through his property, their boots off and their feet in the cool water, and he pulled out a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. "I know it's only been 4 months," he said, "and I know people will talk. But I don't want to waste time pretending I don't know what I want. I want you, Rose Harper. I want to build a life with you on this ranch. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to make you happy if you'll let me. Will you marry me?" Rose didn't hesitate. Yes. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married in July, in a simple ceremony at the church in Golden, with only Rose's mother and sister and a few of Asher's rancher friends in attendance. Rose wore a new dress, pale blue instead of white, and carried wildflowers Asher had picked that morning. There was no elaborate reception, no long guest list, just a quiet exchange of vows and a kiss that sealed their promises. When they drove back to the ranch as husband and wife, Rose felt like she was finally where she belonged. Asher carried her over the threshold, and they laughed as they stumbled into the house together, giddy with love and possibility. Their first months of marriage were full of hard work and deep joy. Rose threw herself into ranch life, learning how to care for the cattle and the horses, how to manage the household on a limited budget, how to preserve food and tend the vegetable garden Asher helped her plant. It was exhausting work, harder than anything she'd done in town, but it was satisfying in a way her old life had never been. At night, they fell into bed exhausted but happy, tangled together under the quilts, talking about their dreams for the ranch and for their future family. Asher was patient and tender, taking time to learn what pleased her, making love to her like she was precious. Rose bloomed under his attention, discovering parts of herself she hadn't known existed. By autumn, Rose realized she was pregnant. She told Asher one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and he swept her into his arms with a whoop of joy that made her laugh until tears streamed down her face. "We're going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "A real family." "We're already a real family," Rose said, but she was smiling. "But yes, we're going to have a baby." The pregnancy was difficult. Rose was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down, and Asher hovered over her like a worried mother hen. He took over more of the household chores, insisting she rest, bringing her dry toast and ginger tea and sitting with her when the nausea got bad. Rose was touched by his devotion, even when she felt guilty for not being able to pull her weight. As her belly grew, so did her energy, and by the second trimester, she was back to helping around the ranch, though Asher limited what he'd let her do. They prepared the spare bedroom for the baby, painting the walls and building a cradle from wood Asher had been saving. Rose sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart full of anticipation. In March of 1885, exactly a year after she'd started riding out to the ranch, Rose went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when Rose thought she couldn't do it, when the pain was too much and she wanted to give up. But Asher was there the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, telling her she was strong and brave and that he loved her. When their son finally arrived, red-faced and screaming, Rose cried with relief and joy. Asher cut the cord with shaking hands, and when the midwife placed the baby in Rose's arms, he sat beside her on the bed, staring at their child with awe. "He's perfect," Asher whispered. "You're perfect." "I can't believe he's ours." They named him James after Asher's father, and he became the center of their world. Rose had never known she could love something so much, so fiercely. She watched Asher with their son and fell even more deeply in love with her husband, seeing the gentle way he held James, the patience he showed during midnight feedings, the pride in his eyes when the baby smiled. The first year of James's life was a blur of sleepless nights and endless diapers and moments of transcendent joy. The ranch thrived too. Asher's herd grew, and they were able to hire a hand to help with the work. Money was still tight, but they had enough, and Rose had never felt richer. On a warm evening in June, as they sat on the porch with James sleeping in Rose's arms, Asher said, "Do you ever think about how different your life would be if Thomas hadn't broken the engagement?" Rose considered the question. "Sometimes, but I can't regret it anymore. If he'd married me, I never would have walked into that blizzard. You never would have found me. We wouldn't have this." She gestured at the ranch, at their son, at the life they'd built. "I wouldn't trade this for anything. Even on the hard days, especially on the hard days." "Because the hard days are ours, Asher. We face them together." He leaned over and kissed her, careful not to jostle the baby. "I love you, Rose Norton. I love you too." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Rose thought back to that terrible day in the church, to the moment her world had shattered. At the time, it had felt like an ending, like the death of every dream she'd ever had. But it had really been a beginning, the start of a journey that had led her here, to this porch and this man and this beautiful, imperfect, absolutely perfect life. The years that followed were full of the ordinary challenges and joys that make up a life. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Sarah in 1887 and another son named Thomas in 1890. Rose insisted on the name despite Asher's reservations, telling him she wanted to reclaim it, to make it mean something good. Their Thomas was nothing like the man who'd broken her heart. He was sunny and sweet and full of mischief, and Rose loved him with the same fierce devotion she gave all her children. The ranch expanded as Asher's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher grew. They bought more land, built a bigger barn, upgraded the house with an additional bedroom and a proper kitchen. It was never fancy, but it was comfortable, and it was theirs. Rose stayed close with her mother and sister, visiting Golden regularly and hosting them at the ranch for holidays. Eleanor eventually admitted that Asher was a far better match for Rose than Thomas had ever been, and Anna adored her brother-in-law, often bringing her own suitors to meet him so he could give his assessment of their character. Rose occasionally saw Thomas in town. He'd married a banker's daughter from Denver a year after breaking their engagement, a practical union that seemed to suit him. They were cordial when they crossed paths, but there was no warmth there, and Rose felt nothing but a distant relief that she'd escaped that fate. As the children grew, Rose and Asher taught them to work the ranch, to value hard work and honesty and kindness. James, their eldest, had his father's steady temperament and his mother's determination. Sarah was fierce and independent, more comfortable in the barn than the kitchen. Little Thomas was the charmer, able to talk his way out of chores and into extra dessert with equal skill. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Asher surprised Rose with a trip to Denver, just the two of them, leaving the children with Eleanor. They stayed in a hotel, ate in fancy restaurants, and walked through the city streets holding hands like young lovers. On their last night, as they lay in the hotel bed together, Asher said, "Do you remember what you told me once? That you were terrified of falling in love with me because you were afraid you were wrong. I remember." "Were you wrong?" Rose propped herself up on her elbow, looking down at him. His face had more lines now, and there was silver starting to show at his temples, but he was still the most handsome man she'd ever known. "No," she said, "I wasn't wrong. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Asher Norton, you and our children and this life we've built. I've never been more certain of anything." He pulled her down for a kiss, deep and passionate, and they made love with the freedom of being alone without worrying about little ears or interruptions. Afterwards, wrapped in his arms, Rose felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. They returned to the ranch refreshed, ready to dive back into the beautiful chaos of family life. The years continued to pass, marked by birthdays and holidays, by good harvests and bad winters, by the everyday moments that weave together to create a lifetime. When Rose was 40, her mother passed away peacefully in her sleep. Rose grieved deeply, but found comfort in knowing Eleanor had lived to see her daughter happy, to know her grandchildren, to understand that the broken engagement had been a blessing in disguise. At the funeral, Rose stood beside Asher, holding his hand, surrounded by their children and her sister, and she felt grateful for the family that had carried her through. Anna married a schoolteacher and moved to Colorado Springs, but she visited often, and her children and Rose's children grew up together, cousins who were as close as siblings. As the children became teenagers and then young adults, the ranch house that had once felt spacious began to feel full to bursting. James, at 18, was already talking about claiming a section of land to the north and starting his own place. Sarah, at 16, announced she wanted to go to college and become a veterinarian, a bold dream for a girl in 1903. Thomas, at 13, was still deciding what he wanted, but he had time. Rose and Asher supported their children's dreams while gently guiding them toward practical choices. They taught them that work was honorable, that love was essential, and that character mattered more than money or status. One evening, as Rose and Asher sat on their porch watching the sunset like they'd done 1,000 times before, Asher said, "We did good, didn't we?" Rose looked at him, at the man who'd found her in a blizzard and mended her broken heart with patience and love. His hair was mostly silver now, and his hands were gnarled from years of hard work, but his eyes were still the same warm honey color that had made her feel safe that first terrible night. "We did better than good," Rose said. "We did wonderful. No regrets, not a single one. Well, maybe one." Asher looked alarmed and Rose laughed. "I regret that I didn't have the sense to walk into a blizzard sooner so you could find me earlier." Asher shook his head, but he was smiling. "You're impossible. I'm yours." "Yes, you are, and I'm yours. Always have been, from the moment I pulled you out of that snowdrift." Rose leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. Around them, the ranch hummed with life. In the barn, James was tending the horses. In the house, Sarah was helping Thomas with his schoolwork. The cattle lowed in the distance, and somewhere a coyote called to the rising moon. It was an ordinary evening, unremarkable in every way except that it was theirs. They'd built this life from nothing, from a moment of despair and a lucky rescue, and a slow, careful mending of a broken heart. And now, 20 years later, Rose couldn't imagine any other life, couldn't conceive of a world where she hadn't walked into that blizzard and Asher hadn't found her. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they'd been the first time she'd spoken them. "I love you too," Asher replied, his arm tightening around her, "now and always." They sat there as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Inside the house, their children laughed about something, the sound drifting out through the open windows. The air smelled like summer grass and wood smoke and the promise of another day to come. Rose closed her eyes and breathed it all in, this life she'd found in the aftermath of heartbreak, this love that had healed her from the inside out. She'd been so young when Thomas had broken her heart, so certain that pain was the end of her story. But it had only been the beginning, the first chapter in a tale that had turned out better than any fairy tale she'd ever imagined. Years later, when Rose was an old woman with grandchildren climbing on her lap and great-grandchildren playing in the yard, people would ask her about her life. They'd heard the story, the dramatic tale of the woman who'd walked into a blizzard after being left at the altar, and the cowboy who'd saved her. It had become something of a local legend, embellished over the years until it sounded like fiction. But Rose would always tell them the truth, which was simpler and more profound than any legend. She'd tell them about the worst day of her life becoming the catalyst for the best thing that ever happened to her. About a man who'd seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway. About a life built on hard work and honest affection and the choice, made new every single day, to love each other well. She'd tell them that hearts did break, but they also healed. And sometimes the healing made them stronger than they'd ever been before. That second chances were real and worth fighting for and could lead to happiness beyond imagining. And then she'd look across the room at Asher, old and silver-haired but still her cowboy, still the man who'd found her in the snow and mended her heart with patience and tenderness. Their eyes would meet, and in that glance would be everything they'd been through together, every joy and sorrow, every ordinary moment and extraordinary blessing. It had all started with a blizzard and a broken heart. But it had ended with love, the kind that lasted a lifetime and beyond, the kind that proved that sometimes the worst moments could lead to the very best things. And Rose, who'd once thought she'd never be happy again, lived every day grateful for the storm that had brought her home.